My name is Audrey Adams. I am 50 years old. And on the afternoon, everything finally cracked. The wind came in off the water and lifted the hem of my jacket like a curious hand, as if the day itself wanted to peek under my calm and see what I was hiding. I was standing on the boardwalk that runs behind the glass and steel line of Harbor Point, the neighborhood where fortunes announce themselves with reflective windows and doormen who never blink. It was a place I'd helped build quite literally, with contracts and signatures and 1,000 late-night emails. Yet that afternoon, I felt like a trespasser, a woman who had wandered into the museum of her own life without a ticket. I had a meeting scheduled in 20 minutes with the banker who said the words, "We all pretend are gentle. Liquidity event." He meant the sale of my majority stake in the company that bore my maiden name Adams and North, though there was no North anymore, not since the settlement. Not since the papers were signed in a conference room where the air smelled like citrus water and quiet rage. I had kept the name out of stubbornness and out of love. It turns out those are the same thing when you've spent 3 decades convincing yourself your sacrifices were strategy. A gull hopped along the rail, cocked its head at me, and then laughed as gulls do, without shame. The laughter sounded like my sister's voice. "Odd," she would say, "stop pretending you didn't want all of this." By this she meant the penthouse that looks west over the river. She meant the cars that appeared in the garage like obedient hounds. She meant the summer place where the ocean throws a tantrum against black rocks and a cedar deck. The one everyone called my monastery because I liked to be alone there, counting the seconds between the lighthouse's slow blinks. I did want it, and I worked for it, and still there was something underneath. Something I had never managed to name. My mother would have called it a bruise. Money, she used to say when I was a child, is a bruise you decide to keep pressing. A boy and his father rolled past me on bicycles. The boy's bell rang like a small bright thought. I hadn't ridden a bike in years, not since the day Liam left a note wedged under the lip of the terracotta bowl on the kitchen island. The bowl where I kept keys and jet lag. His handwriting had always been beautiful, calligraphic. The kind of handwriting that forgives itself. "Mom," the note had said, "please don't try to fix this for me." Beneath it, a plane ticket to a city I had never learned to love because it was the city where his father learned to lie. I folded the memory the way I folded so many things in my life, carefully, and into a smaller shape than it deserved. When I finally turned away from the water and walked back through the revolving door into the lobby, the guard nodded, and the nod said, "I know who you are, but I won't tell. Everyone in Harbor Point speaks fluent discretion." The elevator hummed me up to the mezzanine level, where the private rooms sit like well-behaved secrets. In the reflection of the elevator doors, I saw what strangers usually see, a tall woman with hair I keep long because I like the way it feels when the wind forgets itself. A face practicing composure, a white blouse under a tailored jacket. The silver at my temples that my assistant keeps asking me if I want handled. I don't. I earned every strand inside the conference room. The windows turned the river into a moving mural. The banker, young, expensively humble, smiled. "Ms. Adams, we're nearly there, nearly there." The words brushed my skin like a cold cloth. We sat, we opened folders, we warmed the throat with compliments and disclaimers. And then my phone lit up. Unknown number. Normally, I would ignore it. But I didn't. Because I have learned that the universe uses the same anonymous number every time it wants to remind you of the parts of your life that you've tried to leave in the basement of your memory. "Hello," I said. The line crackled like winter. A woman's voice, low, unpolished. The kind of voice you recognize even as you try to pretend you don't. "Audrey," she said. "It's me." I had not heard my sister's voice in 3 years. Not since the night she stood in my kitchen with her hands around a glass of water, like it was a bird she didn't trust. "You think you left," she'd said, "but really you just climbed." She had asked for money. A bridge loan, she called it, though the bridge had already collapsed behind her. I had said no. She took that no the way some people take a vaccination, furious in the moment and feverish afterward. She wrote me an email titled Inheritance, even though our parents had left us nothing but recipes and the house with the slanted porch. She said cruel things and then said, "I'm only telling the truth." The truth is just an opinion in a costume, Leela, I said. And my voice did something I didn't ask it to do. It softened. The banker glanced politely away. Are you all right? She sighed. I'm pregnant. She is 48. The word landed in my chest and knocked a picture frame off a mental wall. Okay, I said. It's a girl, she added, and then, because Leela always knew how to cut the apple down to its shining core, she said, I'm naming her Eve, because I want to start the story over. I closed my eyes. Is that why you called? No, the word steadied itself. I called because he's back. The room shifted. The banker's mouth kept talking. His voice turned into the soundscape of an airport gate. He mentioned valuations, thresholds, tranches. I kept hearing the name I would not allow to exist in that room, Daniel North. My ex-husband. My former partner. The reason we spelled ambition with 2 signatures. The man who could sell a dream and then live inside your house without paying rent, he's back. Leela repeated. And he's telling people you stole something that belongs to him. What? I asked. Though I already knew what men like Daniel say when the weather changes, everything belongs to them. Whenever it is convenient, the patents, she said. The early ones. The ones you filed before he became. Whatever he became, I found the banker's eyes. He was still listing numbers that added up to a future. I have to take this, I told him. And stood before he could rearrange his face into the expression businessmen wear. When a woman interrupts finance with the heart's messy arithmetic dot in the hallway. The carpet swallowed the sound of my heels. Tell me exactly what you heard, a friend, Leela said. Who still works for people who still owe him? He's been meeting with them. Saying the sale will be contested. It can't be, I said. The words came out too fast, too certain. We settled. We did everything by the book. You wrote the book, she said. But he writes the rumor. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and watched the river behave like a complicated sentence. Why are you calling me, Leela? Why now? She was quiet for a time that felt like a cathedral. Because when I said terrible things to you, she finally whispered, I was pregnant then too. I lost that baby. I wanted to blame you for the weather. I'm calling because I don't want to be that woman anymore. And because she stopped. Because if he hurts you publicly, I don't think I can stand it. I thought of the first office Daniel and I rented. A space that smelled like paper and neighbors' dinners. I thought of the night we stayed until dawn. Working with the kind of joyful cruelty that ambition requires. Making lists of everything we would become. I thought of the lake we once drove to in midwinter to see if the stars were different there. He had touched my cheek with a finger that trembled and said, I am not scared of how big this could be. He was, of course. He was scared all the time. He just learned to aim it at me. Thank you for calling, I said. Text me the name of your friend. I will, she said. Audrey. Yes? Do you ever wish we could go back to the house with the slanted porch and redo the part where we learned what money means? I smiled without teeth. All the time. We hung up the way people hang up when they don't want to make promises they can't keep. I returned to the conference room and listened to the banker finish his aria. He slid a pen across the table the way a priest slides a wafer. If you sign here, he said, we shepherd the rest. I looked at the pen and saw a door. Not today. I said. His face performed the choreography of surprise. Is there an issue? No, I said, and then told the truth with the simplicity it deserves. There's a ghost in the room and I refuse to invite him to the closing. I left before he could furnish the silence with advice. In the elevator, I watched my reflection again and realized that I looked like my mother when she was about to tell a story she had kept hidden because it took too much breath. The doors opened onto the lobby, the guard nodded again, and I stepped back into the honest weather. I drove to the only place I could think to go that did not have Daniel's fingerprints on it. The cottage by the sea, the monastery where the horizon keeps its promises. And the coffee maker is a religion. When I arrived, the late light sat on the water like coins at the bottom of a fountain. The cedar deck had recently taken on that gray-brown confession that would make as it ages. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and let the floor recognize me. On the kitchen table, a small stack of mail performed its humble duty. I flipped through catalogs, a utility bill, a letter postmarked from a city that once loved me back. And then, at the bottom, a thick envelope with no return address. I didn't need it. The weight of it told me who had sent it. Daniel always believed that heft made things believable. Inside, copies of the early filings. The ones I had written on the back of napkins and then translated into the language patent lawyers wear like chainmail. There was a note in his tidy machine of a hand for old time's sake. Let's be honest, he had added a smiley face at the end. As if kindergarten etiquette could exorcise malice, I laughed. And the laugh was ugly. Honesty. I wanted to frame the word and hang it in a hallway labeled irony. I brewed coffee because that is what women in novels do when they are about to confront the past. I do not live in a novel, but the ritual steadied my hands. As it burbled, I spread the documents out across the table and read them as if they were a language I had once spoken fluently and had since used only in dreams. He had circled passages. He had underlined dates with a ruler. He had written in the margins, "we." I remembered the "we" he loved to invoke whenever it improved his share. The phone buzzed again. A text, a name I didn't know. A number from the city where I learned to make myself taller than my fear. "He's telling them you took his seed money and hid it in the patents," the text said. "He's telling them you built the company on his risk, seed money." As if I had been soil, quiet and inert, shaped only by what was poured into me. The old anger reached for me like a coat I had worn every winter until last year. When I finally allowed myself to shiver and say, "No more," I wrote back. "Meet me tomorrow, noon, Harbor Point Cafe. Bring anything you have. I'll bring the truth." I didn't sleep. The ocean didn't either. At 3, I walked the deck and listened to the black water tell me a story I already knew. At 4, I took out the cedar box where I keep my mother's recipes and the letters she wrote to herself. She had been a woman with gentle hands and a fierce accounting. She taught 4th graders how to forgive commas. On the top of the stack, in blue ink that faded toward its confession, she had written, "If I had learned earlier that love is not a mortgage, I would have decorated differently." I pressed that line to my heart and felt the box pulse like a small live thing. At dawn, I drove back to the city. Harbor Point woke with me. The sun peeled itself off the water and stretched across the facades. In the cafe, the ceiling fans made a river out of the air. A man waved from a corner table. He was younger than me by a decade that had not yet taught him to distrust his posture. He introduced himself as Seth. "I used to handle logistics for one of his shell companies," he said without ceremony. "I left when I realized he thought people were boats he could dock wherever he wanted." He unfolded a folder. Inside were emails, spreadsheets with names that looked like subway stations. Notes from meetings that never should have taken place in rooms with glass walls. "He's trying to provoke a shadow suit," Seth said. "Not a real case. A case-shaped rumor. He wants your buyer to spook." I imagined the banker's careful hands. I imagined the board, the faces that applaud until money changes sides. "Of course he does," I said. "Daniel has always preferred stage sets." Seth watched me the way people watch a storm to see if it will come ashore. "Why are you so calm?" "Because I am tired," I said, and smiled in a way that felt like flint. "And because I have the one thing he can't purchase, the beginning of the story." I told Seth how it started in a rented room with paint the color of quiet grief. In a city that was too expensive and therefore honest. I told him about the prototype I kept in a showbox and the night I worked until dawn, with my hair pinned up with paper clips. I told him about Daniel arriving with the kind of confidence that smells like cologne and victory. The way he said "we" as if it were a magic trick that could multiply effort. I told him about the first check he wrote, small, real. A gesture that turned into a debt he would later inflate until it blotted out the sky. Seth listened, then slid his folder across the table. "You'll need this," he said. "And you didn't hear it from me. Why are you helping?" He didn't answer right away. "Because my mother is your age," he finally said. "Because she started a catering business out of our apartment when I was a kid. And men like him treated her invoices like suggestions. Because when I saw your name in his emails, it felt like déjà vu," he stood. "And because I think your sister is right. Stories can be started over." I felt the name strike me like sun through a cloud. "You know my sister?" He shook his head. "No." But I know the type of woman who calls at the exact right moment and says the one thing you needed to hear. After he left, I ordered a second coffee and opened my laptop. I wrote the buyer an email that was not a plea and not a performance. It was a declaration. I attached the early filings. I attached the supplementary agreements. I attached the memo I had written to myself the night Daniel told me he wanted to own the origin myth. In that memo, I had written one sentence and underlined it twice. I refused to disappear from my own story. I clicked send. I sat very still. And then, because the body wants to live, I breathed out. At noon the next day, I met the banker again. He had the expression of a man who has been practicing a speech, in which the word unfortunately features like a refrain. Before he could sing it, I placed Seth's folder on the table. Here's what will happen, I said evenly. He'll threaten a contest. He'll leak. He'll ask shadows to stand up and pretend they are men. In response, we will not whisper. We will publish. We will put the origin story on the record with the kind of elegance that makes gossip look like the cheap furniture it is. He looked at me for a long time. This will be unconventional. I am 50, I said, and I am not collecting conventions anymore. He smiled, small and sincere. All right. We'll do it your way. After the meeting, I walked the long edge of the river. The wind braided itself through my hair. I passed a woman pushing a stroller. The baby inside had the serious eyes of someone who hasn't yet learned how to pretend. I thought of Lila's message, the name she had chosen, Eve, the miracle of beginning. I took out my phone and wrote to her. When you're ready, I typed, come to the cottage. We'll stand on the deck at night and name the constellations wrong and let that be our rebellion. She wrote back a single word, the oldest word I know for hope, yes. Evening folded itself over the city. In the glass of the buildings, the river repeated itself and then let itself go dark. My phone rang again, a number I knew by the way my spine stiffened. I answered. Silence first, because he always choreographed silence. Then, Audrey, Daniel, I hear you've taken to telling stories. I always have. He laughed softly. You never did know how to keep our private life private. Our private life, I said, was a stage we built together, and then you tried to burn for warmth. Colorful, he said. Investors prefer numbers. Then let me give you one, I replied. 50, the age at which a woman decides that if you try to bury her, she'll simply grow roots. He was quiet. I imagined him in a room where the furniture had been chosen by a woman who believed in angles. You won't win this, he said finally. But he sounded like a man reading an old script. I already have, I said, and hung up. Not out of triumph, but out of mercy for him, for me. For the years where we mistook endurance for love, that night I returned to the cottage. I cooked pasta the way my mother taught me, with water salty as a story you've told too many times. I took my plate out to the deck and ate while the lighthouse blinked. I thought about money and its bruises, about sisters and their late apologies, about sons and their letters. I thought about how, in the photograph taken of me at 22 the day I signed my first contract, I look like a girl who has seen the ocean for the first time and cannot believe it will keep arriving. I thought about my name, the sound it makes, the names I might still earn when the moon rose. It looked like a seal pressed into the wax of the night. I whispered to it because I have learned that prayer is just a kind of honest inventory. My name is Audrey Adams, I said to the dark that listened. I am 50 and I am not done. The wind answered by getting up and walking along the deck beside me. Somewhere down the coast, a bell buoy rang like a heart deciding to be brave. In the morning, the world would do what it always does, pretend it had never been broken. In the morning, I would drive back to the city and sign the papers and then walk out into the street where everything looks new if you tilt your head. In the morning, I would choose a dress that felt like a declaration and I would pin up my hair with paper clips. Again, just because I could. In the morning, I would write to my son and tell him the truth I had learned too late, that fixing is not loving, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do with a broken thing is to leave it broken, so the light can find all the edges. But that night belonged to the sea and to me and to the girl I had been, the one who collected wind like it was currency and believed that beginnings were a skill. I sat until the stars made their small decisions. I listened until the water remembered my name. And when I finally went inside, I left the door open just enough for the ocean to breathe with me. In the morning, the ocean had the decency to be ordinary. Gray light, a gull quarreling with its hunger. The long unspooling hiss of tide dragging pebbles like someone sweeping a marble floor. I made coffee and drank it standing, then showered. Then chose the dress that felt like the inside of a ripe fig deep. Unapologetic, and tied my hair back with a black ribbon I found in the bowl with my keys. The ribbon used to belong to Leela. I'd picked it off the porch rail one Thanksgiving when the wind tried to adopt it. I'd kept it because that's what I do with the things I can't say out loud. Driving in, I practiced my face in the rearview mirror until it stopped being a performance. By the time Harbor Point grew out of the road like a glass orchard, I had reached the calm that lives under the first calm, the one that doesn't need witnesses. The guard nodded our ritual and the elevator translated me skyward. The banker was already in the conference room, sleeves neat, mouth loaded with contingencies. My counsel joined by video. She wore reading glasses that made conspiracies seem solvable. We signed the disclosure first. It wasn't the kind that thrilled markets. It was the kind that cleans floors. We published the origin story, dates, schematics. The showbox with its ridiculous dignity. The first check whose zeros once made me faint and now make me shrug. The memos that read like letters to my future self. We attached the early patents, their footnotes tidy as pressed flowers. We underlined the lanes between my work and his myth. We wrote the sentence the world always resents, here is what happened. While the compliance team did their delicate dance, my phone vibrated with a message from a number I didn't have saved but recognized anyway. The way you recognize the smell of a house you stopped loving, you've made a mistake, he wrote. Not a hello, not a name. The buyer won't like the noise. Noise is what happens, I replied. When you move furniture in the dark, he typed and deleted. Typed and deleted, the dots blinking like a small fever, then sent nothing at all. Silence again, his preferred weather. We finalized the terms. The banker exhaled like a man stepping off a balance beam. A few days for funds to settle, he said, careful, as if speaking near an infant. Your philanthropic vehicle will be funded simultaneously per your instruction, my instruction. The phrase warmed me. It had taken me to marriages, one company, one house with a slanted porch, and the griefs that arrived without last names to learn the difference between power and control. Power makes rooms safer. Control makes them smaller. I had chosen the vehicle months ago, the Adams Fellowship, seated not just with money but with time. Space, and a locksmith's patience for women building in private. A place to keep the beginnings warm. When the papers were signed, I stood and felt an old ache move out of my body as if it had rented the space month to month, and had finally found a cheaper neighborhood. On the way down, the elevator paused at the mezzanine and accepted a stranger, a woman about my age, in a blue dress that looked like a promise she intended to keep. She smiled. The kind of smile women give one another when we recognize the weight the other is pretending is a shawl. Big day? She asked lightly. Big enough, I said. Congratulations, she murmured. The way you say it at weddings and funerals. Outside, the river had dressed itself in sunlight and opinion. I crossed to the cafe for a coffee I didn't need. The barista, a girl with eyelashes that should belong to songbirds, wrote my name on the cup with a heart above the Y. I carried it to a table near the window and watched the city remember its choreography. 10 minutes later, a shadow fell across the table. I didn't need to look up. Some arrivals you can feel in your molars. May I? He asked, already pulling back the chair. I looked at the space he intended to occupy and thought about the years I had curated my rooms to accommodate his elbows. No, I said, and pointed to the chair at the neighboring table. He laughed, low, performative, as if there were an audience hiding behind the ficus. He took the other chair and leaned his forearms on its back like a coach about to misteach a lesson. He looked almost exactly the same Daniel always invested in surfaces. But time had written a small correction at the corner of his mouth. You've caused a stir. Air does that when you open a window, I said, and sipped my coffee. The heart above my Y wobbled against the lid. He watched me like a man trying to spot a crack in a wall he'd once painted. This could have been simple. It is simple. We tell the truth. We invite anyone who has invested emotionally in the rumor to step into the light and dry off. He smiled. You still talk like a poet when numbers would do. Numbers, I said. Always arrive late to the story. He tilted his head, practiced concern softening the edges. You sure you want to fight? It gets messy. You're not young. Thank you for the weather report, I said. It's sunny and 50. He sat back, studying me the way a cat studies a glass of water. What do you want, Audrey? I want my son to never again write me a note that is braver than my choices, I said before I could varnish it. The truth startled him. Good, it startled me too. I stood. Enjoy your coffee on the sidewalk. The day widened. I walked to the park where the wind practices for its future as a rumor. I sat on a bench and texted Liam lunch. The dots blinked. Tomorrow, he wrote. Same place. The place was a diner that insists on calling salads bowls in a neighborhood that used to be a whisper and is now an advertisement. It was where we had last spoken carefully, like to people carrying a tray of glasses over a floor full of marbles. I spent the afternoon with the lawyers, then with my accountant, then with a woman from the fellowship team who had the kind of attention that makes you want to hand her your problems like a bouquet. We went over the first cohort, a biochemist with a prototype in her suitcase, and a toddler in her lap, a sculptor who welded during lunch breaks, a municipal clerk building a data tool that would make budget meetings less theatrical. We didn't choose them because their stories made good paragraphs. We chose them because when I read their applications, I felt the showbox of my own beginning open inside my chest. Evening came. I drove to the cottage. On the deck, the wind rehearsed the alphabet on my skin. The lighthouse took its time. My phone buzzed. A photograph of an ultrasound, grainy universe, the caption from Leela, Meet Eve. I stared until the image became a feeling. She looks like trouble, I wrote back. Our kind, come by tomorrow. She asked. I made your favorite lemon bars and the lemon too. I smiled into the dark. Lunch with Liam, then the porch. Sleep came like an apology. Morning arrived with the effrontery of birds. At the diner, Liam was already in a booth, elbows neat, hair too long. The scar above his eyebrow that he earned on a bicycle when he was 7 and insisted he could fly. He stood to hug me and then pretended he hadn't. We ordered eggs we would ignore and coffee we would punish. He looked at me the way sons look at mothers when they are trying to calculate the cost of forgiveness. I read the disclosure, he said. Of course you did, I replied. What did you think? He shrugged, a movement inherited from a man I no longer loved. It was not dramatic, he meant it as a compliment. I guess I always thought beginnings were more cinematic. They are, I said. When you're lying, he smirked. It broke and became a smile. I kept waiting for the part where he was a genius. He is, I said, and watched surprise rearrange his face. At certain things. At looking into a crowd and finding the person with the softest chest. At predicting which adjective a room will applaud. At presenting hunger as vision. He stirred his coffee and didn't add anything. Why did you stay with him so long? Because I thought I was the kind of person who could fix things, I said. And because he knew how to say we in a way that made me want to let him keep the word in his mouth. He nodded, then inhaled like a diver. I left because I didn't want to be the problem you kept trying to solve. His eyes were so green in that light I wanted to write them a letter. I'm coming home, he added, and then rushed past it. Not to the penthouse. To the idea of home. To dinner on Sundays if you promise not to ask how long I'm staying. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. His hand did not flinch. Deal, I said, and felt something old click back into place, not the broken before. But the after you earned. We ate our cold eggs like victors. When we parted, he kissed my cheek and didn't pretend it was an accident. I drove directly to Lila's, the house with the square of yard that refuses to learn obedience. She opened the door with her apron on and flour on her cheek, and a belly that moved like a new planet deciding on its gravity. We stared at each other in the doorway the way sisters do when the history is too long for a hello. Are we hugging, she asked, or are we making a museum exhibit? We hugged. It wasn't cinematic either. It was odd and necessary and human. In the kitchen, the lemon bars sat on a cooling rack like good behavior. We ate them before they were ready, burning our tongues and laughing at our greed. She told me about the baby names she didn't choose: June, Mira, Ruth. She told me about the nights she woke to worry gnawing through the drywall. I told her about the fellowship and the cohort and the message from the man who believed that quiet was the same thing as control. You'll win, she said. Not because you're right. Because you're willing to be seen. We took our coffee to the stoop and watched the neighborhood do its errands. An old man walked to old dogs, the leashes as careful as veins. A girl on rollerblades negotiated with gravity. In the distance, a siren practiced its scales. Layla put her head on my shoulder the way she used to in the back seat of the car, when we took turns pretending to sleep so the other could have the window. When the baby comes, she said, I want you in the room. I will be wherever you tell me to be. I said and meant it. The contest came, of course, but not as a lawsuit. It came as a whisper that tried to grow teeth. It came as a column that managed to mention my age 4 times into paragraphs. It came as a podcast host who invited me on, and then tried to turn my sentences into sword swallowing. It came as an email from a man who used to fetch coffee in our first office, explaining in a tone of sorrow that genius is often misunderstood by women who never attend to context. It came as a dinner invitation from an investor who used to call me kiddo, and now called me legend, which is just kiddo in a tuxedo. We answered with light. We published the documents. We invited the early engineers to tell their own stories, and they did, in voices that made me cry in the unglamorous way. We released the photographs, the showbox on my lap, me in a thrifted blazer with sleeves rolled to my elbows, the whiteboard where I had written in red a question I still ask myself every week: what would this look like if it were easy? The buyer did not spook. The market blinked and then resumed its lecture. The fellowship inbox filled. Women sent me their beginnings and the maps they had drawn on paper towels. Men wrote to boys raised by mothers who made rent by engineering miracles. Sons who used to sit under folding tables at community meetings, counting the shoes of power. On a Thursday that smelled like rain, the fun settled. An accountant sent a PDF with numbers that used to be science fiction. I forwarded it to the foundation, then closed my laptop and went outside to let the weather tell me who I was. The first drop found my forehead, a benediction with bad aim, that night. I went to the cottage with a bag of groceries and a book I wouldn't read. The deck was damp and new-looking. I poured 2 glasses of wine and placed one on the railing for my mother, who always preferred company she didn't have to talk to. The lighthouse blinked its slow eye. The sea rehearsed its one great line. My phone vibrated once. A message from a number that had learned my shape, no words. Just a photograph, a hand the smallest one and another hand Lila's cupping it. The caption: soon, I wrote back, I'll be there. I slept. I dreamed of a room with no corners. In the morning, a gull laughed and I laughed back. I drove to the hospital with the windows down and the radio on, not because I was listening, but because I liked the way sound kept me from narrating my own life. Layla was already in the bed, hair a mess of bravery, eyes wild with purpose. I hate everyone, she announced, then gripped my hand so hard I wondered if bones are opinions after all. It took hours and it took forever. Nurses came and went, wise like midwives in epic poems. The doctor had a ponytail and the steady hands of someone who understood that miracles dislike drama. I spoke when spoken to. I breathed when told. I pressed a cool cloth to Lila's neck and told her the story of the slanted porch and the cat that never belonged to us, and the winter the pipes froze and we learned to boil snow. I told her the story of the ribbon, how the wind tried to adopt it and failed, and then Eve arrived. All alarm and declaration. She was purple with effort and then she wasn't. She was all future and then she was here. They put her on Lila's chest and she made a sound like a secret that wanted witnesses. I cried in the way of old women and new aunts. Layla looked up at me and grinned a grin that did not belong to any man I had ever known. Start the story over, she said. Right now, so I did. I whispered into Eve's soft, furious ear. My name is Audrey Adams, I said. I am 50. You are brand new. The world is a complicated house. I promise to show you where the light switches are after. When the room had quieted and the hallway agreed to stop hustling for a minute, I stepped outside to call Liam. He answered on the first ring. "I'm an aunt," I said, laughing at my own arithmetic. "You're a cousin. I'm on my way," he said. "Do I bring flowers or tacos?" "Tacos," I said. "And napkins. And the story about the time you tried to jump off the dock and learned the difference between almost and always," he laughed. And in that laugh I heard the house I had been building finally unlock its front door. Days later, months later, I don't know. Time went sensibly out of style. I stood again on the boardwalk behind Harbor Point, with the wind tugging at my jacket like an impatient niece. The gulls heckled, the river practiced being inevitable, the city ranged its mirrors. I looked up at the glass where my reflection had learned to dress itself, and I saw a woman who did not need the windows to be told she existed. I thought of the banker's pen like a door, the folder like a match, the fellowship like a greenhouse where we grow our refusals into fruit. I thought of Daniel somewhere rehearsing a new version of himself. I let him be the weather in another county. At home, the cottage, the monastery, the room with the coffee maker that believes in me. I taped a new piece of paper above the desk. In block letters, with a felt tip that bled like an honest cut, I wrote, "Tell it before they do." The next morning, I got up and did. The days that followed Eve's birth rearranged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself lingering at Lila's, standing in the doorway just to watch my sister fall asleep mid-sentence, with her baby pressed against her chest. Liam came by with tacos, then again with a bag of groceries, then again without excuse. The three of us sat around the small dining table and, without announcing it, practiced being a family that could hold silence without fear. At night, I returned to the cottage. I began to write not contracts or disclosures, but sentences that asked nothing of me except honesty. Pages filled with the names of women I had mentored, the echoes of boardrooms where I had learned to listen with a blade behind my smile, the long litany of beginnings that had carried me here. Some nights I wrote letters to my mother, some nights to the girl I had been, and some nights to Eve, whose future I wanted to build like a fortress with wide gates. The fellowship launched with more force than we expected. Applications flooded in. I read them on the deck while the sea rehearsed its endless hymn. One came from a young woman who had designed a solar-powered desalination unit out of scrap metal. Another from a writer whose novel had been hidden in a drawer for 10 years. Because her husband told her stories were childish. Each application was a flare in the night sky. I realized this was how you burn down rumor, not with fire, but with light. Daniel's shadow still reached for me. Articles surfaced, podcasts speculated, whispers tried to write alternate histories. But every time his version threatened to root, another truth bloomed louder. Engineers stood up and spoke about who had been in the room, who had scribbled equations at midnight, who had refused to let exhaustion win. Their testimonies were not fireworks. They were candles, steady, undeniable. And together, they lit the room brighter than any myth he tried to manufacture. One evening, Liam and I stood on the cottage deck watching the lighthouse blink. "You look lighter," he said. I admitted. "Because I finally stopped trying to edit myself into someone else's story," he nodded, then placed his arm around my shoulders, a gesture I hadn't felt since he was small enough to fit under my chin. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "I can stop running from mine." When I went inside that night, I taped another paper above my desk, next to "Tell it before they do." This one read, "Start again as many times as it takes," and I did. Every morning, with coffee and sea wind, I wrote until the pages told me I had built something truer than silence. I decided to end it on a single day. We booked a hall with good acoustics and ugly carpet and called it a founders forum, which made the press arrive with notebooks instead of knives. My counsel sat in the front row, the fellowship team in the second, Liam beside Leela, who cradled Eve under a blanket patterned with small moons. On stage, there was only a lectern, a screen, and the show boxed its cardboard corners softened by years of carrying the weight of my beginning. I told the story once, clean dates, prototypes, the first check that didn't buy authorship, the contracts we both signed. The patents that bore my hand. I read one paragraph from a memo I wrote at 23 sentences, and a signature that looked like Hope learning cursive. Then I stepped aside and let the others speak. An engineer described the night we built the proof and the power went out. We finished by headlamp. A paralegal held up the filing receipt with a timestamp that didn't care about charisma. A receptionist, now a product manager, said she remembered who carried the box in every morning and who arrived after the coffee was already gone. We put the documents on the screen. We put them online. No adjectives, only nouns. By the time I returned to the lectern, the room had the quiet that happens when air adjustments are finished and doubt realizes it packed the wrong suitcase. Of course he came. Daniel walked down the aisle the way men practice in mirrors, chin at a negotiated angle. Smile that could be translated as magnanimity or warning. He didn't ask to speak. He announced it. The moderator, a woman who had fielded senators and salvos, handed him a microphone. Like it weighed what it should, he tried charm, then reminiscence, then the vocabulary of vision. He called me my partner twice, as if a phrase could turn back a clock. He said the magic industry words that make investors feel seen: seed, risk, scale. Then he gestured at the showbox and laughed in the register that once turned me to salt. Are we really going to pretend the future was carried in a cardboard container? I lifted the lid and held up the prototype. It was inelegant and brilliant and stubborn. No, I said. We're going to remember it. Silence did what applause couldn't. He looked to the crowd for a rescuer and found witnesses instead. He tried a final move, threat by implication, but the moderator cut his mic. With the elegance of a surgeon, the hall exhaled. The story, already written, stayed written afterward. People filed past to touch the box like it was a reliquary. A girl barely 20 said, "I thought I was late. I guess I'm early." An older man with the posture of regret said nothing, just nodded at the papers on the screen and left lighter outside on the steps. The day felt taller. Reporters asked if this was victory. No, I said, just accurate. The buyer's counsel shook my hand. The sale would close without footnotes. Rumor, deprived of oxygen, curled into itself and went to sleep. That evening, we gathered at the cottage. The table held tacos, lemon bars, a bowl of cherries that stained our fingers like signatures. Liam did the dishes as if he had always lived in my kitchen. Layla fell asleep on the couch with Eve on her chest, the baby's breath measuring the room's mercy. I stood on the deck with a glass of water and watched the lighthouse blink its slow metronome. The sea kept talking in one sentence, the only one it knows, the one that means keep going. My phone buzzed. An email from the foundation, the first cohort confirmed. I read the names out loud to the wine scientist, sculptor, clerk, coder, and felt the deck steady under my feet. This, I thought, is how a life answers itself, not with a thunderclap, but with a list of women you're going to bet on. Liam came out and leaned on the rail beside me. You looked like grandma up there today, he said quietly. Not an age in spine, she would have told me to tuck my shirt in, I said, and he laughed. And the laugh put a small, warm weight in my chest that I decided to keep. I wrote 2 notes before bed. The first to Daniel: the story is public. May it free us both from invention. I didn't sign it with anger. I signed it with my name. The second to myself, taped above the desk beside the others: leave the door open for light, not ghosts. Weeks thinned into their right sizes. The fellowship opened its doors. I spent mornings reading prototypes and afternoons walking by the water. On Sundays, Liam cooked something ambitious and slightly wrong, and we ate it like it was tradition. On Thursdays, I took Leela and Eve for long drives up the coast, stopping wherever the sky looked like a decision. Sometimes we said nothing at all. Sometimes we named the constellations wrong on purpose and let that be our rebellion. One windy afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside, the original cap table, annotated in someone else's hand, and a single line on a yellow sticky note: you were right to keep the showbox, no signature. I put the papers in the drawer where I keep the recipe for my mother's lemon squares. And I didn't bother to wonder whether remorse had finally learned my address. Some letters are for the past. Mine were for tomorrow. On the anniversary of the sale, I woke before the light and walked to the edge of the deck. The horizon was still deciding. I said my inventory out loud, my name, my age. The names of the people inside sleeping like books on a shelf. The names of the women starting over on purpose. I thought of the boardroom, the hall, the mic cutting to silence. The showbox open like a mouth telling the truth. My name is Audrey Adams. I said to the sea that kept its promises. I am 50 and I have begun again. The wind moved through my hair like a benediction. Somewhere up the coast, a bell buoy counted to 1. I went inside, put coffee on and opened a blank page. The house smelled like lemons and Tide and new paper. The beginning, as always, waited where it always waits, right here.